Good evening. My name is Logan Court. I'm a student project manager at the Clarke Forum for Contemporary Issues at Dickinson College. When we held Clarke Forum events in person and on campus, we took a moment to acknowledge that the land on which we gathered belonged to indigenous peoples for centuries before European settlement. Currently, I am inhabiting the ancestral land of the Lenape, the Susquehannock, the Conestoga, the Haudenosaunee, the Shawnee, the Erie, and later the Indian children of the Carlisle Industrial Indian School. I encourage everyone watching this evening's program to take a moment after our presentation to acknowledge the tribes whose traditional land you currently inhabit. And on behalf of the Clarke Forum, I would like to welcome you to tonight's event, Combating American Racism in the Era of Trump, Towards a Pedagogy of Justice. Last summer was dominated by the conversation on American race and policing, while this winter has brought political unrest and white violence. In response to the publicness of recent exhibitions of American racism, many are turning towards education as a starting point for redefining the US's relationship to white supremacy. Anti-racist education is making massive strides in educational institutions who are now changing their course requirements, curriculum, and course contents in an attempt to dismantle American racism and protect democracy from the classroom. As a college student, diversity of opinion, race, and background have all been things to strive for in all aspects of a college community. Despite these goals, anti-racist topics and Black history have not permeated all classrooms the same way. I am hopeful that our current moment is the catalyst for increasing the presence of such topics in our classrooms, and I'm hopeful our conversation this evening will illustrate some such modes of education. Dion Lassiter is an expert in the field of American race relations. He has taught on issues of race across the United States and much of the rest of the world. Currently, Lassiter is the executive director of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, where he has legislatively delegated authority to investigate complaints alleging unlawful discrimination. He is also the current president and co-founder of the Black Men at Penn of Social Work at the University of Pennsylvania School of Social Policy and Practice, which is the first Ivy League Black male social work group. Lassiter has been recognized by the Philadelphia Tribune as the most influential African-American leader from 2010 to 2020. And this discussion-led presentation will be moderated by Dr. Amr Ahmed, who is the Interim Executive Director for Equity and Inclusivity at Dickinson College. Dr. Ahmed is an organizational strategist whose work is grounded in social justice and commitment to community. There will be a question and answer session immediately following this presentation, so please feel free to type your questions into the live chat next to this YouTube video at any time. Please post questions only in the live chat feature, as this is not the space for exchanging personal opinions during the speaker's presentation. And thank you for attending, and please join me in welcoming Mr. Dion Lassiter and Dr. Amr Ahmed.
Good evening, thank you for having us. Doc, I think you may still be muted.
I apologize. Good evening, everyone. And Mr. Lassiter, thank you so much for joining us today. It's really an honor to be able to spend this time with you today at a particularly poignant and salient moment in this country's history around race relations. Before we kind of get to the current reality, I know that we have a lot of students who are joining us today. And I think sometimes it's hard for them to envision how you get to a position like yours of influence and impact and live a life with the kind of commitment and alignments that you live your life with. And so if you could share a little bit about your backstory of just how you, beyond just the bio, like what was it that was instilled in you as a young person that caused you to go on this trajectory with your life?
Wow, a great question. And let me say, Dr. Ahmed, I'm really, as I said when we were doing the test run, really humbled and honored to be in this space with you. I think it's a great question. And let me once again say good evening to all those that are tuning in. The ultimate goal this evening is for you all to, as best you can, to stay present to what Dr. Ahmed and I are going to be talking about in this very relaxed, but also strategic and intentional conversation. I'm glad you posed that question because I'm a former professor teaching at both the University of Pennsylvania and Westchester University. And I first start with the premise that every student that I've come across is great. and some of them just didn't see their greatness. And I believe all human beings in the context of the King tradition are great. For King said that we all are great because we all can serve. He went on further to say that if you're going to sweep streets, sweep the streets like Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel. So for me, I came of age in two locales, the East Coast, born and raised in Philadelphia, to Marilyn Adele Patterson, who became Marilyn Adele Lassiter, and Sergeant Leslie Lassiter III. I also lived in South Central Los Angeles in the latter part of the 70s, early 80s, as my mom was working on her second degree at the University of Southern California. But my community of North Philadelphia was not your stereotypical community, right? When we look at the mere fact that we're in what Carter G. Woodson started as Black History Week, that morphed to Black History Month, that went into, all of the things that we know, we tend to look at the Black family as a monolith, right? Or we start from a deficit model. And so my community was rich with individuals who I grew up with who had fathers in their households. I was blessed to have my mom, my dad in the household, and my grandmother, my mom's mother. Her name was Mom, Thelma Patterson. And I learned immediately my work ethic from my mom, who actually cleaned for Jewish people, and ironically was the caretaker of Sadie T. Alexander before she began to experience the onset of dementia. For the students in the viewing audience, Sadie T. Alexander is the first African-American woman to get a law degree from University of Pennsylvania and the first Black woman to get a PhD in economics in the country, also from University of Penn, and she was married to the historical Judge Raymond Pace Alexander. So growing up in my household, my older brother and I, we were very awkward as kids, discoordinated. My brother was 6'9", couldn't play a lick of basketball. I'm 6'6", couldn't play a lick of basketball. But I see that as a blessing in disguise because mother and father, they put books in our hands. And I can remember as early as 7th and 8th grade having W.E.B. Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk. Now, for students, and Dr. Ahmed would agree with this, sometimes you meet professors who engage in peculiar arrogance, right? What is peculiar arrogance? They want you to know what they don't know, but they pretend to know, but they want you to know it, but they don't know it. So I'm not going to sit here and say, I'm reading Du Bois, I'm reading Carter G. Woodson, I'm reading Alex Haley, The Roots, I'm reading Cry the Beloved Country, and I knew the themes. If anything, I was faking it. Our parents would say, turn off the television, read this. And I would act like I was reading it. Very Christian household. The adults would tell you not to cuss or curse. And you would eavesdrop and hear them in the evening times listening to Richard Pryor cussing or cursing. You would hear Red Fox cussing and cursing. And so everything that they told us not to do, they did. Don't drink. You would catch dad sipping. You would catch mom drinking wine, but it was a very eclectic household where you heard Mahalia Jackson and Bessie Smith, and you heard Nina Simone, and you heard Lena Horne, and you heard Marvin Gaye. But the outside of the community was constructed with everything that you can imagine growing up in the urban griot, coming from that soil of North Philadelphia. So the work that Doug Massey talks about with American apartheid, you had that. You had drug trafficking. And I'm talking about Philadelphia. You had drug trafficking. You had rates of poverty. Our high school was only high, and that was not a good high school. So the family members who went to that high school, they talked about torn pages, and then the next generation talked about torn pages in the books, and you talked about torn pages in the book. Living in Los Angeles was different because you never knew at that time that you grew up in South Central, because mother and also father kept you in Boy Scouts. They kept you in youth choir. So if you can imagine, coming from Philly to LA, we didn't know anything about don't wear red because that's Bloods. Don't wear blue because that's Crips. We were Kyle, Devin Lassiter, and Chad Dion Lassiter, and we were these awkward, discoordinated kids. But in full transparency, when I lived in Los Angeles, I pretty much got beat up every single day for the first kind of 2-3 weeks we lived in Los Angeles, because we were in a community called Van Ness Avenue that was really drug ridden, but also gang violence. You had Bloods and Crips. I found a very unique way to make sure that the Bloods and Crips didn't continue to beat me up. I did their homework. They may have not been interested in being in sixth grade and schoolwork, but I did their homework. But that community also had a famous boxer by the name of Sugar Ray Robinson. Not Sugar Ray Leonard, Sugar Ray Robinson. And he was retired, and I would always go by his house and wave at him, and I would always ask him, can I cut his hedges? And I struck up a friendship with Sugar Ray Robinson, who would tell me about, Black history and tell me about life. Moved back to Philadelphia in 1986, went to a middle school, then went to high school. And then high school hits me, and in typical systemic and structural inequality ways, as you can imagine, my white counselor, when I started talking about college, she said, well, your dad was in the service, why don't you go to the service? And that wasn't what I wanted. My brother had preceded me to college prior to that. I ended up applying to Purdue University in Michigan, only because I watched them playing football. Had nothing to do with academics. But then my mom and dad said, no, you need to go somewhere realistic that you can get in realistically. So I applied to Norfolk State, Virginia State, Virginia Union, which were all HBCUs, historical Black colleges and universities, and also Johnson C. Smith. And I got into Johnson C. Smith University on a academic scholarship from the United Negro College Fund. So I'm amazed that this era that we're in with Stacey Abrams and Senator Warnock and Kamala Harris and multiple others, where we're talking about HBCUs, historical Black colleges have always mattered. And some may say, well, I remember when I was teaching at Westchester, Professor Lassiter, why do they have HBCUs? They don't have all white institutions. And I said, you've never heard of predominantly white institutions? Every university that's not an HBCU is a predominantly white institution. And as you know, and multiple individuals who are watching this evening, they know that the HBCUs were created because of institutional racism, prejudice plus power. Coming out of the abolitionist movement, you couldn't read or write, you couldn't even go to school. And so some of the white abolitionists and others, started the HBCUs. And so from my time at Johnson C. Smith University, that's when I was introduced to D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, which was the first silent film of its kind that purported the racial stereotypes of Black people, the pickaninny, the eating the watermelon, the mere fact that a Black man was trying to save a woman from jumping off a cliff, but she bought into the myth and stereotype of Black men being brutes and monsters. She jumped to her death. And the ironic thing about Birth of a Nation is that as a silent film, the actors in the film were all white and they wore blackface. Well, it was at that time that I learned about a gentleman by the name of Oscar Micheaux. Oscar Micheaux was a Black film director. He was the Spike Lee of his generation. And he came back with Birth of a Race, showing Black people from a strengths-based perspective, similar to Paul Robeson and the Emperor Jones. And so it was at that time that the W.E.B. Du Bois from the home, the W.E.B. Du Bois readings from the school, now at the Black college, it came alive. Oh, wow, Du Bois went to Fisk University. You're reading the Philadelphia Negro. You're debating Dr. Ahmed on his last name. Is it Du Bois or is it Du Bois, right? not that it mattered. This was the first Black man to get a PhD from Harvard University. Carter G. Woodson gets a PhD from Harvard University. John Hope Franklin, who was the emeritus at Duke University, who penned the book From Slavery to Freedom, he gets a PhD from Harvard University. So it's at that time where it came alive. It is that at that time where I'm reading E. Franklin Frazier and I'm reading Ida B. Wells and Du Bois and Martin Luther King, that I said, okay, this notion of wanting to be a communications major, because you couldn't play basketball and you have low self-esteem around that, because in the Black community, it's similar to Biggie Smalls, not generalizing on stereotyping. You either got a wicked jump shot or you're slaying crack rock. And my parents was like, no, it's more than that. I realized, no, I'm not going to be a sports commentator. And I heard a calling from God that I was going to be a social worker and that I was going to leave Johnson C. Smith and come back to Philadelphia and make my community better. So I sojourned back to Philadelphia. And for you students, I was supposed to graduate from the period of 1990 to 94. I did an additional year. I ended up taking an additional major, which was African-American studies, because I was scared of the world. I didn't want to face the world. So I was like, let me be a fifth year senior. And so I come back And I started working as a community social worker in Philadelphia. And then I met a Jewish mentor who talked to me about the benefits of going to the University of Penn. His name was Dr. Arthur Schwartz. He took an interest in me, looked at my intellect, poured everything that he had into me. And once again, chased by this thing called low self-esteem. I'm going to go to Temple University. It's North Philly. I'm familiar with North Philly. And if I step on the campus of the University of Penn, I'm going to be in a class to the left and right, Dr. Ahmed, with individuals who parents and grandparents' names are on buildings.
Mm-hmm.
Kimball, Klein. And so I ended up
feeling that imposter syndrome.
That's it. That's exactly it. So I ended up going to University of Penn, and was the best decision for my life. Very privileged university, HOPs, halls of privilege, FOPs, fortresses of power. And so I was able to gain access to people, to policies, to opportunities. And I was able to use that and leverage it, similar to like the spook that sat by the door, but in a more therapeutic way. So, just in summary, got my master's in social work from the University of Penn, tops in my class, received several awards, graduated in 2001 with my master's, and then looked around at graduation and saw Derek Jackson, Derek Felton, Darren Tolliver, and several others, and said, hey, it's 6 of us, here getting ready to get our MSWs across the stage. Why don't we stay committed to the university like our white colleagues do? And so we formed in 2003, 2 years later, the Black Men at Penn School of Social Work Incorporated, which is comprised of Black males who have come through the University of Penn with their PhD, their doctorate in social work, their master's in social work, doing anti-racism training all around the country for schools as well as penal systems, multiple grants with regards to mentoring youth whose parents are incarcerated in a state or federal prison. So did that. From there, ended up heading over to the W.E.B. Du Bois Collective Research Institute at the University of Penn Graduate School of Education with major luminaries like Margaret Bill Spencer, Mary Frances Berry, V.P. Franklin, Dr. Vivian Gadsden. My mentor for 10 years while I worked at that center was Dr. Howard Stevenson, who's noted in his own right. Everyone knows him now as Brian Stevenson's older brother.
Yeah.
And then people who came through the Du Bois Collective Research Institute were individuals like one of my best friends, Dr. Cleo Jacobs, Dr. Chris Ashford, Dr. Mark Lamont Hill, Dr. Greg Seaton, Dr. Tabitha D'Angelo, and so many other people. From Penn, I recognized that, hey, I'm not going to work on a doctorate degree at any point in time right now. At some point, I am, and at some point during that thinking, I was. But it was more about how can I continue to grow the community? Understanding that most of the power is in the macro level, but there are some changes that you can make from a macro level. So if we're looking at a force field analysis, all change is plan change from the bottom up, not the top down. But my life at that point was just dedicated to being a community social worker. And then once again, Dr. Arthur Schwartz said, I think you should look at leadership. And so I started looking at leadership roles and became a director at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, working with young people who have type 2 diabetes, reducing sedentary behavior, increasing physical activity. The race variable, if I may suggest, was because we understood that there were food deserts. In our communities, there are readily available bodegas, mom and pop shops, but then in our white communities, there's the construction of fresh groceries and supermarkets. And so, a lot of people were eating the McDonald's because you can get a 4 for $4. $4 can get you a soft drink that sugary is not really good for you, a cheeseburger, fries, and nuggets and things of that nature. From there, I went over to become the executive director of the first house of its kind in the entire country, the American Red Cross House. I was there for 9 years. It served as a facility that provided shelter for individuals who lost their homes due to a catastrophic event like a fire. And as you know, if you've ever been to Philadelphia, if 4412 is engulfed in fire and it's a row house, the whole entire block may possibly go up. So I worked with individuals there. And then for the past 3 years now with the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. I've never had a job. All of these things have been callings and assignments because it's kind of crazy to have to go to bed at 10 o'clock at night when you love CNN and MSNBC, Fox National, Fox Local, and ESPN to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to catch a train by 5 o'clock to get you in Center City, Philadelphia, to get you to Harrisburg by 8 o'clock. So I've done that for 2.5 years and only missed work one time because of the inclement weather. And now because of COVID, I've been working home since March. The last thing I'll add for this journey to where I got to was mentorship. The thing about me is I was always willing to listen and learn. Evidence of, how before we got on, I said to you, I'm humbled and honored to be in this space with you because the organizers, Sarah and Logan, they sent me a link of your bio. And I'm just like, I wish I would have had it earlier, right? But when I read it, I said, oh, wow, right? And so work has afforded me, or this calling has afforded me opportunities to work in Africa, Israel, Canada, Norway. And 4 weeks after the earthquake in Haiti, my colleague Darren Tolliver, who's working on his PhD in social welfare at Widener, we were in Haiti performing trauma counseling, seeing the devastation that we saw, but also some of the institutional racism, the imperialism, the colonialism, and American capitalism. So the journey has been filled with people praying for me, Sunday school teachers, mother and a father. It's been filled with trauma. I've been the victim of police brutality at the age of 12, the age of 14. I was the victim of police brutality. At that time, you didn't know to come home and say it was Officer Fitzpatrick and his badge number was anything. But there's scars that are still there. And so this moment that we find ourselves in activated a form of vicarious traumatization for me, where I literally had to call my counselor and say, listen, I head up this civil rights agency, the top civil rights enforcement agency in the Commonwealth, but I'm also experiencing a form of trauma because of those visuals that you see that hit your neurotransmitters. But that's been my journey.
Thank you so much for that. And I think that the last part speaks to how many of us in the work have to continue to engage our own healing as we continue to be resources for others in the education and the structural work that people like yourself and myself engage in. You brought us kind of more to the current times now, and I think in your role as executive director, it's been a pretty intense time with regards to race relations. Obviously, it's not new, but it's a particularly acute social moment. First, the age of Trump, and even just the last few weeks and months have been quite an interesting period of time in the history of white nationalism in this country. So can you talk a little bit about what the contours and what has characterized what the works look like for you in this unique time?
Yeah, certainly. And I start from the context of the Tea Party and Glenn Beck and Bill O'Reilly, who would always tell you on Fox National, you're entering the no spin zone, and you knew emphatically that you were in the spin zone, that he was going to whitewash any forms of suffering as it was directed towards people of color. So I look at Glenn Beck in context, Sarah Palin in context. I look at Rush Limbaugh in context. I look at those Tea Party individuals in context. Then I look at the addition of Barack Obama as the first president of the United States in the narrative that we're post-racial, when we didn't roll up our sleeves, take off our real or metaphoric cufflinks to do the work of addressing white racism, white supremacy, white violence, and how whiteness allows the mob to mob us. They mob us, they get off, but the mob, we end up losing our lives. Or in the case of Jacob Blake, we live to see another blessed day to tell the story about white racism and surveillance and tyranny by some police officers in our democracy. So we know that post-racial is still a mirage. The 8 years that we had Obama in office, we looked to people like Michael Eric Dyson and Eddie Glaude and multiple others who wrote about that period of time. But we also recognize that during that period of time that he was under massive scrutiny, that Obama also was the recipient of more death threats than any other president prior to him becoming the president. And so to the aspect of Donald Trump, a mediocre white man. I don't know excuse me.
If that.
And I don't know the quote off of the top of my head by Lyndon Baines Johnson, but it's that quote, and you probably know, Dr. Ahmed, where Lyndon Baines Johnson said, if you can convince the poorest of white men that he is still better than the poorest of black men, and whatever that quote is, but what Baines Johnson was getting to is that the white poor should be aligning themselves with the black poor against the white elite. The white
It's the
elite, that's the
whole
white.
purpose of the construction of race
Yeah,
in this country.
That's it. And so then the moment that we find ourselves in, we can look at the framework of our democracy since its inception. A beautiful democracy, but not without pillars of contradictions, right? White supremacy since its inception. The mere fact that it starts off with talking about slavery and not what John Hope Franklin talked about, and from slavery to freedom, the Mali, the Ghana, and the Songhai dynasty, that there existed individuals. So the folk that were stolen from Africa, brought to the Americas, were scholars like you, change agents like me. They were craftsmen and craftswomen. And so when we're talking about this moment that we're in, and we hear people verbalizing the January 6th insurrection, and they state the country has never been more divided. What planet are you on? We had water fountains that said colored only. We had water fountains that said white only. We had our mothers, our grandmothers, and our forefathers and foremothers having German shepherds bite their breasts off. We had water hoses. We had the Birmingham and bombing, and the bombing and Birmingham, and the Birmingham and Birmingham. Those little girls only wanted to go to a Sunday school, right? And then you see the correlation from that time to Dylan Roof going into an African-American church and killing 9 people, and he's taken alive. Timothy McVeigh taken alive. Jeffrey Dahmer taken alive. Branch Davidians taken alive. David Koresh taken alive. Gary Heidnick taken alive. And then Kyle Rittenhouse kills people, and he walks right by. He waves at the authorities. So the moment we find ourselves in, surprise many in white America. And it's surprised many in white America because you couldn't get away from it. COVID had us hostage. You had to look at it, except for those individuals who were essential workers. And even then, they had to come home. And then the surprise of the democracy. On every side of the color line and gender line, whites and others were holding up signs: no justice, no peace, no racist police, Black Lives Matter. So mothers and fathers in communities that racially socialize their children through the anthology of hate and dissing Black humanity now had their children saying, "Nah, mom, this is the police state." And they're in Norway and Sweden and Denmark, and they're in Nicaragua, and they're in Managua, Nicaragua, and they're in Ecuador. They're all over the globe, Dr. Ahmed, as you know, as a scholar, and you study it and I study it. And then for those of us who are academics and intellectuals, we looked at it from an anthropology perspective, a sociology perspective, an ethnography perspective, and multiple other lenses. And we conclude what we've always known, that America was founded on the bedrock and the hallmark of white supremacy. And that does not mean that our white colleagues should get in their feelings, but it means that it is what it is. And to the work of Derek Bell, Faces in the Bottom of the Well, it's permanent. So even though I talk about combating, I won't use language like, how do we dismantle? Because it's as old as empire. When King talks about the greatest purveyor of violence is my own United States government, and then he talks about the triple evils of poverty, militarism, and racism, you don't end racism until you end capitalism, colonialism, and imperialism, and those things don't die. So it's here with us. And so this moment that I find myself in with the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission has been challenging. I rely on people like, and grandma would always say, don't get into name calling because you might forget people, but I rely on people like Elaine and Bob Curry, who run the Hazleton Advisory Council, Marcia Berry, who you and I were talking about with Carlisle, a lot of my staff on my faith, adaptively coping and maladaptively coping for the students. I smoke a cigar. I don't smoke a blunt. I'll drink a Maker's Mark. I'll go for a walk. I'll hit the punching bag because I suffer from racial fatigue, because it's not just the moment we find ourselves in, it's as you're looking at the anthology of police brutality directed at unarmed Black people, you also have in your office anti-Semitism. You have transphobia that was directed at Dr. Levine, and God bless Dr. Levine on her nomination by the Biden-Harris administration into the assistant secretary. I'll say publicly, President Biden should have made Dr. Levine the secretary, but that's okay. It's not bad. It's okay to be a professor or an adjunct, but then you have all these things, and then you have the funding formula. And so a typical day for me at the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission is making sure that I don't engage in a form of ethnocentrism. I'm a product of the Black community, product of the historical Black college and university, product of the Black church. But the role that I'm in, I have to remain socially justice neutral and look at all of the challenges. And so we get a call about anti-Semitism, transphobia, homophobia, white supremacist ideology, white supremacist actions. Pennsylvania, to the people who are viewing this, ranks number 8th in the country as it relates to hate groups assembling. We have 60 hate groups in the city, in the state of Pennsylvania. And I'm going to push back and say, some of you come from communities and possibly households where white supremacist ideology is spewed. And that's why this is about helping students, teachers, and stakeholders to dismantle. Even though I put that in the description, really it starts with the dismantling of your isms. How can I address my toxic masculinity, my classism? How can I address my bigotry, my discrimination, my white supremacist ideology? And so that's what it's really about, self-introspection. It's not about others, even though systems are important. It's about how you, from your little, what Martin Luther King would call hamlet and village, can change. When your mom says to you, don't you bring no black person home, or when someone says, don't date on the same sex side of the gender line, or how dare you come into this house and talk to me about Dr. Ahmed, and your father is the one getting up every day, going to the railroad industry and doing what he needs to do. And that's the person you need to be looking at. The myth of American exceptionalism, Anglo-conformity, acculturation. No. Thomas Jefferson did not have a love affair with Sally Hemings. He raped Sally Hemings.
Yes, yeah, I think you're speaking to that which is endemic, and I think so many people have not been taught the historical context that I think you've really covered so eloquently. And then I think you speaking to the work from the inside out is so important in how we show up in our commitment for identities in which we are not targeted. And that's part of the work from the inside out, in our ability to be able to show up. And the only way we can ask folks to do their work is if we're willing to do our work. And so I'm really thankful and appreciative of that. And so as you look in this, let's bring the time window even narrower into just like the last month. We had this very public insurrection of white nationalists that came from all over the country, many of whom we're learning disproportionately active military personnel and police. And I think that speaks to the embeddedness that you talked about that exists in families and in communities, and the degree of institutionalization of that embeddedness, because a lot of these people are in positions of power. And so what has that looked like for you? What does the last month look like for you?
So the last month has been burdensome and troublesome because you see the January 6th events, and you see the journalistic malpractice with regards to calling it anything but domestic terrorism, white nationalism. You see how the media seduces us into race, but they don't want to call it for what it is. And so the past month has been a challenge because I also penned an op-ed piece in Philadelphia Inquirer that has millions as it relates to circulation. And it was entitled Angry White Men. You can Google it, but not you, Dr. Ahmed, but the larger audience. Mm-hmm. And you read the comment section, which is something I've never done. I've been doing op-ed pieces for 10 years. But the reason why I read the comment section is because my aunt was concerned about my safety. She started talking to me about how there was no critiques with the first couple of comments as it relates to the op-ed, but it was like, Chad sounds like an insidious name. It's like, and I'm quoting, it's like you drop your child off at college and you say, hey, the parents brought an Audi 4 for Chad. And I'm just like, that's ignorant. And so with this op-ed piece, you also had, I sit on the board of governors for St. Christopher's Hospital for Children. You had the president of our board chairman, and the president of the hospital reach out to me. White males, great op-ed piece. Thanks for all you do. And then you had other whites who were reaching out to the chairman of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, Joel Bolstein, calling for my resignation. A white woman started off her, and she'll remain nameless for confidentiality purposes. I wish I could clap back like they say in hip hop, but she starts off her email by saying, "Dear Mr. Bolstein, I'm a white woman. And my reflections were, so. I've worked for 40 years in low-income communities, so. And I was a Republican until January 6th. Now I'm independent, so. And then she goes into this whole thing about, is Mr. Lassiter in his op-ed, is there a disclaimer? Is he representing himself or the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission? And that's no different than white women historically. See, that's the thing. We try to get away from this aspect that white women aren't members of white nationalism and the Ku Klux Klan. And the data speaks to in 1920, the chapter that had the most women in the United States was Lancaster, PA. We saw white women at that January 6th thing. We've also heard white women, not the television shows, the movies of Rosewood and other shows where white women have talked about Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Emmett Till, where white women have trumped up this whole notion of the white woman, precious, pristine, damsel in distress. Look what happened. Rosewood up in arms, Tulsa up in arms.
You took the thoughts right out of my head. Yeah.
Emmett Till killed, right? So she's writing this and I'm like, how dare she? So she would have to engage in a form of research to figure out, okay, he's the executive director, but he's a Black man. So there has to be someone over him. And then there's the deafening silence among lots of colleagues in the state until Secretary Newsom of the Office of Administration and Human Resources reached out to the governor and said to the governor, we have to have a conversation. And so to Governor Wolf's credit and all of the members who make up his cabinet, all the secretaries, we have over the past month been doing the work to look at systemic and structural racism in the Department of Aging, in the Department of Transportation, and DHS. Dr. Levine, before she left, she launched an ingenious thing by saying two things. Let's have a race institute, and let's also call for racism as a public health issue. So the past month, on a professional level, I've been dealing with that. And then also, it's how do I get my staff of 81 to not create a safe space, Dr. Ahmed, but a brave space that we may disagree, but how can we do it like Martin Luther King and Rabbi Abraham Yahshua Heschel talked about, that beloved community philosophy, to come into that brave space and have the conversation. So that's been one thing. But I also struggle with my white colleagues who are like, God damn, I didn't do that. I didn't create that. And then you have to say, it's not individualized, it's structural. And then that's against the backdrop of making sure that they understand it's okay for you to pick up White Fragility. It's okay, by Robin DiAngelo. It's okay for you to pick up Ibrahim Kendi's book, but you can't go wrong with where do we go from here? Chaos or Community by King. You can't go wrong with, Why We Can't Wait by King. You can't go wrong with In a Single Garment of Destiny, A Global Vision of Justice. You can't go wrong with Dismantling Racism, The Continued Challenge to White America. And lastly, you can't go wrong with Uprooting Racism, How White People Can Work for Racial Justice by Bill Hibble.
My friend.
You know this, in this moment that we're in, we're caught up in how to be an anti-racist. And that's not a knock against the young man who wrote the book, but we're excited about, they have coloring books and storytelling books that he promoted. You have to ask yourself, how do the elites in this moment give somebody $50 million to combat racism? How do you emerge and where do you emerge from? And then in your book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, you talk about Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois and others being racist. No. They wanted the fortunes of white racism. He said racism from an institutional standpoint, people of color can't be, right? And so the moment that I'm in, it calls for a budget freeze that started in March, a hiring freeze that started in March, keeping 81 people on your shoulders, in your mind, in your spirit, in your soul, to make sure that they don't get furloughed, keeping the work relevant, because we have all forms of unlawful discrimination complaints that come in against the backdrop of housing moratoriums and sexual harassment. You do me a favor, you don't have to pay your rent. So we have all that stuff going on. So there's never a dull moment. Then I got to deal with what happened last month. Walter Wallace Jr., mental health, shot by the state. You hear whites close to you, whites who want to just debate you out of just forms of their own little fragility and superiority. Well, Chad, why was he coming at the cops with a knife, not understanding that you've had whites who have done that and the cops have asked them, tell me about yourself, buddy. Do you have any pets? Do you have any family? Do you want to go home? And they go home without their lives. And then Eric Garner loses his life And then the institutional racism is the coroner saying, well, he died not by a choke, but he already was morbidly obese and had type 2 diabetes. So it's been a rough month, Dr. Ahmed, and thank you for that space to just speak back to that. It's been a heavy month on multiple levels, macro, meso, and micro.
Yeah, and I thank you for that. And I do want to interject that, obviously there was a further collective trauma in the recognition of Black folks and people of color throughout this country, knowing that we wouldn't have made it to those steps. And the way, let alone break windows, go in, be able to implement assassination attempts, and still go back to our daily lives and jobs. But I also want to add, just because I'm represented here in my community, that what I've tried to remind people also is that if I even tweeted one of the things that these people had tweeted, somebody would have been at my door and I would have been deemed an enemy combatant. And
no, you
have no legal rights.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And so like, even for, because I go by energy, even for people who are viewing this tonight, they may say, well, how does he talk like that? And he represents the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. Well, and it's not Socratic. I know how people think. Some people think. My pushback would be, I'm a free Black man in America. And this is not a job. I'm the executive director of Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. And Logan opened up with my bio, but I'm like Martin Luther King in the sense that a reporter once asked Martin Luther King, hey, listen, do you have a martyrdom complex? And he said, no, though King knew at some point the thing was heavy. That sting, that viciousness, that hatred of white supremacy, it was behind him, and he knew that he was going to die at some point. And King said, no, I don't. And they said, well, if you were to have a funeral and they wrote your eulogy, what would you want them to say? And King said, don't tell them about the Nobel Peace Prize. Don't tell them about the PhD at Boston. Don't tell them, I think it was Boston University. Don't tell them about, the seminaries, the work in the seminary at Crozier Theological Seminary, which has since closed. It was in Chester, PA. He said, so the reporter said, well, what do you want him to say? He said, just tell him I'm a drum major for justice. So I speak like this from the perspective I do, because if the governor or my commissioners, which are 11, ever got rid of me, what I have readily available is a $5,000 scratch off. And I'll take that $5,000 scratch off and I'll try to help the poor. I really don't have a $5,000 scratch off, but I think people like you and I, don't blame us for calling out white supremacy. Colin Kaepernick took a knee against the anthology of police brutality by some members of law enforcement. They're the ones that made it about the flag and made it about the national anthem, which the fourth stanza of the national anthem is racist. And you're right. Let's not even look at the Capitol down in DC, the state capitol in Pennsylvania. If 20 Black people showed up, no weapons, and just simply say, yo, open back up the government because we're Black barbers, or we run Black taverns, they would have been met with possibly not force, but there would have been some sort of altercation. And to your point, the degradation that we witnessed, that this is an individual who came into Nancy Pelosi's office, no hierarchy, it's not because she's Nancy Pelosi, but you took a selfie. You went through the Capitol saying, hey, where's Mike Pence? Let's hang Mike Pence. You were white thugs, you were a white mob, you were any adjective that we can say, and we say it with love, that they were wrong. I was part of the Million Man March. I went to the Million Man March when I was in college. That had nothing to do with the government. The Million Man March was atonement. Be at one with God. Stop using the N-word. Stop calling Black women B-I-C-T-H, not just in your rap lyrics, and this is not a hit against hip hop, but it was about, let's not stand on the corner in trash, talking trash, let's sweep up the trash. Let's start mentoring programs, or what Howard Stevenson calls CPR, curriculums that stand for cultural pride reinforcement, that instill all of those principles of Kwanzaa and multiple other principles. And I'm gonna tell you, Dr. Ahmed, we get down there and you have helicopters above, you have National Guard, you had state troopers, you had police, and they were able to do what they did to the Capitol. And it'll be whitewashed. It'll be whitewashed in the next couple of weeks, and we'll be on to the next story. But for those of us who are committed to justice against the backdrop of injustice, we have to tell this story of how do you combat American racism, Not racism over in Germany, not racism over in Canada, not racism over in Switzerland, American racism. This institution that is built on the seduction of whiteness, unearned privilege. And those of you who are watching this, you can do it if your elementary level of introduction to white privilege or others is Peggy McIntosh or Robin DiAngelo or Jane Elliott or Tim Wise. But the reality is, all you have to do is look at American history, the level of superiority versus the level of making others feel inferior. And the last thing I'll say on this is, even in this moment, what it really was white victimhood. It was Trump trying to tell some white males and white people from the rural areas and the Rust Belt areas, the political establishment has left you behind. No, it's the white elites that's kicking the ass of poor white people and others. And so it's time for whites to recognize that you are disadvantaged by your own white racism.
Yeah, it's cut your nose to spite your face. And so, yeah, absolutely. Thank you for all of that. I think we're getting to our question and answer period. I can't wait to hear from some of the folks that want to ask a question. So is it Logan that's gonna shepherd this for us?
Yes. So I just want to encourage, again, everyone that's viewing right now to go ahead and put some more questions in the live chat. But before that, I'll start off with some of my questions for you, just to fill up the time before people get some more questions in there. Mr. Lassiter, what advice do you have for educators who seek to educate themselves at the same time as educating others in anti-racist education specifically?
I think that's a great question, and I'm gonna plagiarize. I'm going to go back to something that Dr. Ahmed said, which was this moment we find ourselves in. A lot of universities are trying to get engaged in these type of courses. The University of Penn School of Social Policy and Practice was the first school of its kind in the country that made courses on American racism and social work practice mandatory for an entire year. And I came out of that school. So for 50 years, we just celebrated the 50th year anniversary. So 50 years, it was teaching social workers how to be culturally competent. It was important for social work students to understand the black-white binary. A lot of students want to get away from the black-white binary. Oh, let's talk about intersectionality. The black binary is rooted in that. Let's talk about multiculturalism. The black-white binary is rooted in that. Take a gay black man with HIV versus a gay white man with HIV, and you'll see the differences. And so take a poor white person and a poor black person, and you'll see the differences. Chris Rock put it in a more of a humorous term. He said, I'm on stage and I'm a millionaire, but the white busboy at the back of the room with one leg wouldn't want to change places with me. He's going to ride that white privilege thing all the way out to see where it gets him. So to your question, Logan, that's the context for me. Universities should have never gotten to this point where they needed this moment before they ushered in courses on equity and inclusion, social justice courses, because there have been young women on college campuses talking about male dominance and power differential, i.e. date rape. There's been Asian American Pacific Islander students saying, I don't see myself represented in the curriculum. I don't see myself in the syllabus. Most of our classes are a plethora of everyone else except for Native American indigenous people. And so I'm glad that universities have come around, but in order to teach the things that they need to teach, they have to be able to teach the historical underpinnings of the framework of white supremacy. And so when we talk about white studies, even some white studies courses are watered down and whitewashed. And so I think that we first start with an agreement that we need to have these courses. Secondly, I believe that what we do is we train teachers of color to teach the course, and we train white professors to teach it as well. But it can't be a chore for our white professors. Dr. Ahmed, he's a person of color. I'm a person of color. We live this. It's not an intellectual exercise. So for our white colleagues, it can't be, oh, I'm teaching this at Dickinson, I'm teaching this at Columbia, I'm teaching this at Harvard. It has to be a true and earnest commitment. So I think you start there. I think also from a strengths-based perspective, student organization groups can also have what I call the beloved community brave spaces where they can create the environment that they want. And it has to be an earnest partnership, right? When I taught at University of Penn, all of the syllabus readings and books were by male authors. Noah Padowitz ended up coming to me. She said, Professor Lassiter, she said, where are the women authors? She said, we need to have some women authors. I said, well, give me some. She said, have you ever heard of Audre Lorde? I said, I haven't. She said, what about Bell Hooks? I said, I haven't. And that had a lot to do with my toxic masculinity. So that's how I would answer that question, that this is a pivotal time for universities to implement these courses, but it can't be touchy-feely, tiptoe through the tulips, kumbaya, we shall overcome. It needs to be really about addressing white supremacy and all those branches that come from it, like anti-Semitism, effective prejudice, bigotry, discrimination, and so forth.
I know not everybody's asking for my opinion right now, but I do really the phrase that's in my head is walk the walk. Don't just talk the talk. We got the NFL's talking about end racism, but Cap still doesn't have a job. I live in Western Massachusetts, worked in Amherst, one of the most white liberal places in the country. They won't step foot in the predominantly Puerto Rican working class community that I live in. The idea, there is a culture of white liberalism in the academy that thinks racism is out there, right? Racism is in here and in the structures and in the body of our institutions, and so we have to walk the walk.
I like that, and I know, Logan, we have to go to other questions, and we will. But Dr. Ahmed, thank you. As a form of liberation, right here in the moment, I experienced that at University of Penn, because a lot of my white colleagues in the School of Social Policy and Practice, their life was Aban Pond, COSI to get their salad, the bookstore, Starbucks, or where their vehicles were parked. And they didn't see racism inside the School of Social Policy and Practice. You're telling students to take a one-year mandatory course on American racism and social work practice, but when the Black men at Penn School of Social Work Incorporated called for anti-racism training for all the school, faculty, administrators and students, they ran from it, right? And so King talked about that too, that the worst kind of racist is the liberal and the moderate. These are King words that hide behind their racism. So you're absolutely right.
Great, thank you both. The next question is from the chat, and it says, at the end of your recent op-ed in the Philadelphia Inquirer, you point to the need to bring angry white men into the Republic on an equal footing, and you ask who will step up. Are you seeing any answers to your question?
I have had contact with some white men or white males in the city of Philadelphia County, Bucks County, and Montgomery County, that took exception to the op-ed piece, but they reached out, and the tone and tenor was not a lot of rhetoric. And we have agreed to disagree, but we have a couple of private Zooms that we're going to set up, this one particular group, to really talk about it. I think what I was trying to convey, and great question for the person that put that in the chat, I think what I was trying to convey, first and foremost, linguistically, I was not mentioning all white males, right? That I don't generalize and stereotype. So when people say Black and Hispanic people are leading with the rates of coronavirus, they're not talking about all Black people and all Latinx people. But I think one of the things I was just trying to simply do is say, listen, let's have a conversation, right? Because when you're looking at combating American racism, it can't continue to be Dr. Ahmed, myself, and people of color, right? It has to be white folk who we say, don't give up your privilege, but how do you leverage your privilege on behalf of Black humanity and other forms of humanity? But great question.
And I would like to see more white folks that aren't making a job out of it, that you're just committed because you're committed.
Yeah, and that's what I was trying to say to the viewing audience. I'm not taking a shot at Robin DiAngelo, right? But do we have a body of work for Robin DiAngelo? See, we have a body of work for Tim Wise. We have a body of work for, Tim Wise has a new book out called Dispatches from the Race War, right? Mm-hmm. Really great book. Jane Elliott has a body of work, but then there are other people like Winthrop North, who wrote the book Black White. I'm probably botching his last name, but what I was just simply saying is, to Dr. Ahmed's point, and he's not taking a shot at Robin DiAngelo.
No, I know these people.
Yeah, there's a lot of new people who are on the scene with this stuff, and there's a lot of Black theorists and scholars who've done this forever. Naeem Akbar, Visions for Black Men, Breaking the Psychological Pains of Slavery, and multiple others. I know we have other questions.
Yeah, and then the next question is, what advice do you have for schools or communities that want to engage in their courses, but the faculty or staff are not interrogating their own biases and privilege?
I think students have to hold them accountable. I really believe that you have trusted faculty that you can go to, and you can simply say, hey, listen, we have to do the hard work, but they're not doing it. I think that student organizations need to talk to the chairs of their departments, the deans of their departments, and really get individuals to call upon the school to do unconscious bias training for the president of each university, the leadership of each university, and various departments. And I believe that, this cohort of students over the past 5 years for me are not the kind that I remember who, they were kind of afraid to say something, right? This cohort of students over the last 5 years for me, the research I've been able to do, they really own it. This is my education. I'm paying your salary, not in an arrogant standpoint, but we're just not going to take this. So it would mean someone like you, Logan, and multiple others saying, hey, listen, we're doing the hard work as students, and even white studies, or when we hear terms like white privilege, white racism, white violence, it's beating us up. But guess what? We want professors to also not get beat up, but to unravel and unwrap some of their biases as well. So I think that students have to look at themselves like that, and they can utilize the student centers that are on campus, provided that those student centers are willing, those leaders are willing to address it as well.
Next question is, we don't have a common understanding of our history and we aren't taught our true history. Are there efforts at the national level, and do you see possibilities for creating a common history program?
I think that's a profound question, and I would be placating, ingratiating, displaying with false generosity to try to answer that question. I don't know. Dr. Ahmed, what do you think? And I'm not trying to put you on the
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yes, all right, one more time. We don't have a common understanding of our history and we aren't taught our true history. Are there efforts at the national level, and do you see possibilities for creating a common history program?
I'm not aware. I mean, I know that we have the new museum in DC that is important. We have counter narratives. We have Howard Zinn's work, The People's History of the United States. We have counter narratives to a history of white supremacy that covers and that shelters how white supremacy has been structured and embedded into this nation. So, and embedded into our education system in particular. So, I mean, I think the best thing we can do is draw from our counter narratives that we have access to, and to weave that with our broader understanding of what has actually happened in this nation and what has to be reconciled. We need a truth and reconciliation process. I lived in South Africa during the truth and reconciliation process. It is something, it's happening in Canada as we speak. We need one in the United States.
Yeah, and now that Dr. Ahmed unpackaged that, I understand the question, but for those who are viewing this, that's what you call intellectual collegiality. Don't pretend to know something that you don't. But I would just also add to that, that's why I think the work of John Hope Franklin, From Slavery to Freedom, is very important, because, it's very powerful. Everything is powerful. I think that there's so much stuff out there from John Henry Clarke, Yvonne Sertima, so many who have written the counter narrative to the narrative that continues to be, Christopher Columbus discovered the world, when the data is really speaking to, he went up and down the coast of Africa, pillaging and raping African women. I know we have more questions.
Yeah, in the interest of being respectful of ours and viewers' times, I'll just end with this last question. As institutions and organizations implement anti-racist training and programming, are there specific aspects of anti-racist work that are often overlooked or ignored?
I think the ones that happen from a grassroots perspective oftentimes get dismissed, or I think the ones that are more radical in nature. And what I mean by that is, when you look at some of the film work of Nate Parker with Birth of a Nation, and he told the story of Nat Turner, and this most recent work that he did with American Skin. I think what we do is, we're okay with, the whole aspect of let's get along. But when it becomes more militant, like, Stokely Carmichael, when it becomes more militant, like Malcolm X or that, and he ended up, his new emergent identity was that of El Hajj Malik Shabazz, I think people kind of run away from that. I think that we have to get away also, just my opinion, from the traditional groups like the NAACP, the Urban League, Al Sharpton's National Action Network. We can still borrow remnants from them, but this is a new group of young people who are saying, we're not going to take this anymore. Take the Frank Rizzo statue down in the city of Philadelphia. our version of Bull Connor, or we're going to take it down. Take the Robert E. Lee statue down. Take the Ulysses S. Grant statue down. Rewrite the curriculum that tells the accurate history of America. So I think it's not an either or, it's both and. I think what also gets overlooked is that there are white colleagues, right? Whether we call them colleagues, allies, co-conspirators, there are white, racially conscious individuals who see the humanity of Black people. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote an autobiography on the great John Brown, right? And so there are, you know, when you think about the freedom riders, when you think about people in this very moment that we're in, they're on every side of the color line, gender line. I just wanted to end by simply saying, for everyone that's looking, this is what Martin Luther King said, and where do we go from here? Chaos or community, on page 74. This is what King's definition of racism was, and I'll end my part. And thankful to be in this space with Dr. Ahmed, you, Logan, and the organizers. King said, racism is a philosophy based on a contempt for life. It is the arrogant assertion that one race is the center of value and object of devotion, before which other races must kneel in submission. It is the absurd dogma that one race is responsible for all the progress of history and also can assure the progress of the future. Racism is total estrangement. It separates not only bodies, but minds and spirits. Inevitably, it descends to inflicting spiritual or physical homicide upon the outgroup. You can't go wrong with King. You can't go wrong with Black Reconstruction, the souls of Black folks, the Philadelphia Negro, and Du Bois's very dissertation. You can't go wrong with Ida B. Wells. You can't go wrong with Frederick Douglass. And certainly there are some white colleagues and some new stuff, Eddie Glaude, Mark Lamont Hill. But you can't forget Manny Marable, Cornel West, Michael Eric Dyson, and multiple others. And you can't go wrong with some of your professors at Dickinson College who don't have books to their credit, but they show up every single day in the brave space to teach you a pedagogy towards justice.
Thank you very much for your words. And I want to thank both of you for your time this evening and also sharing that with us. So with that, I'd like to conclude this event, and I'd like to thank as well everyone that's come to view this event. It will remain on YouTube as a live stream to be viewed later as well.